nomination for the Speaker of the House again, but she didn't have the full support of her party while she was doing it. Ahead of her nomination, 16 Democrats circulated a letter calling for new leadership when Congress reconvenes this January of 2019, with Democrats obviously in the majority. To get back to the gavel, Pelosi, who was the first female speaker, needs to win an absolute majority of votes cast on the House floor. If just 17 Democrats vote against Pelosi on the floor, she might not have the votes to secure the leadership post she previously held. While no Democrat has launched a challenge to her, those opposed to Pelosi as Speaker have said new leadership could emerge in a floor fight. The battle, of course, is on the floor with California Representative Linda Sanchez. She was one of the lawmakers who signed the letter calling for new leadership. Again, ladies and gentlemen, I'll go back to the fact that Nancy Pelosi has not been in opposition basically since 1987 in her own district. Now, how can it be so lopsided, and yet they make her and put her into a position of leadership in the House? She's been doing this off and on as the minority or the majority for 25 plus years. And the only thing she really has to say about what she's done is Obamacare. And no, I'm not going to call it what they call it, which is the Affordable Care Act. No, it's Obamacare. And it was a disaster. And it is a disaster. And they still haven't really done anything about it. And yet, they're probably going to put her back in the leadership. A person who has not been opposed basically in her district since 1987. Does that make sense, ladies and gentlemen? Is that someone who you think is going to be a partisanship with President Trump, who's going to be willing to cooperate and try to find common ground? Or is it just going to be the same old thing, which is somebody like Jeff Flake, who is standing firm in his vow to oppose all of President Trump's nominations, not one, but every single one of them, until the Senate votes on legislation to protect Special Counsel Robert Mueller's probe. Now, why would you object to every one of President Trump's nominations? Because you hate him and you want him out. So they're using Jeff Flake to do this, even though he's a GOP Republican senator who's obviously on the out in January of 2019. And they replaced him with none other than a Democrat. So, ladies and gentlemen, you can see, obviously, that they're going to do whatever they can to circumvent where Nancy Pelosi is going to get back into power as the majority in the House, even though she's barely been opposed in her own district as a senator since 1987. And they're talking about bipartisanship. Senator Flake, a frequent President Trump critic who has opted against running for re-election this year, conveniently, followed through on his threat this week and joined Democrats in opposing a bid to advance Thomas Farr's nomination to serve on the federal bench for the Eastern District of North Carolina. This is one of the smaller appellate judicial nominees that President Trump. Vice President Pence was then forced to break a tie on a procedural vote in a rare Senate intervention. A final confirmation vote on Farr's nomination has been expected, but the news has learned it is now being pushed until December 3rd. So you can see, ladies and gentlemen, that President Trump is pushing the narrative on the judicial branches because of what I have called in my latter videos, judicial tyranny, Because remember, the legislative, executive, and judicial branches should all be very equal in power, and they are not. And President Trump is trying to gain back that judicial tyranny that the Democrats, including Nancy Pelosi, have built over her 25 plus years on and off as being a minority and a majority in the House. So you can see that President Trump is doing exactly what he needs to do. It's a war, ladies and gentlemen. No matter what Nancy Pelosi or the Democrats tell you, it's a war. And they know what is at stake. President Trump knows what's at stake. And they're still trying to use even the GOP, even senators Republican, to try to go against President Trump. At the same time, they're wanting to please their constituents, such as Nancy Pelosi, so that they can continue to do what they've been doing, which was unopposed, especially for Nancy Pelosi. Isn't that ridiculous, ladies and gentlemen? I mean, even the Senate Judiciary Committee this week has voted on nearly 24 judicial nominees scheduled later for this week. The committee was expected to vote for this and advance 6 of President Donald Trump's nominees to the circuit courts and 15 to district courts, as well as multiple bipartisan pieces of legislation, according to the Daily Caller. The cancellation is occurring as outgoing Republican Senator Jeff Flake pledged to oppose all judicial nominations. Do you get that, ladies and gentlemen? They're not bipartisan at all because they know exactly what President Trump is doing, even though maybe the American people don't. He's trying to make things equal again. Instead, they're going to do everything they can to oppose him. Linda Parker, thank you for coming to the chat. Jeff Flake hasn't figured out who is going to kill him first. Well, I know he's a turncoat, but at the same time, just look at what has happened with the senator situation in Arizona anyway. They probably knew McCain was not going to be a human being much longer, and in this world or in our world much longer. So they're repositioning because they want to turn Arizona. Arizona has been a Republican controlled state for years, including the Second Amendment. I believe in Arizona, the Second Amendment is probably one of the strongest states in the country. And now they've got Sinema, who is going to take Flake's place. And Flake is going out trying to battle against President Trump in every detail that he possibly can, because there's not going to be any retribution by his own constituents because he's leaving anyway. You notice that? Thank you, Linda, for that. That's exactly right. Joe R. Rivallo, I hope I pronounced that right, Joe. Not to worry, something really bad is going to happen to all of these idiots. Well, I don't wish anything on anybody, but I'll tell you, people going to jail should not be far-fetched. But that's another story, because they've been getting away with this for decades, and a lot of times most of us just haven't known about it. We've been too busy watching our cable television and doing our own thing every day during our lives with our family and friends and so forth, and they're doing this under our noses, ladies and gentlemen. It's obvious. Blue Healer 100, McStain was the first before they executed him. McStain, I guess that's what you're meaning. Well, I don't know if they executed him or not, or he just disappeared off the planet, whatever. But it did seem coincidental when it happened. They mentioned that he was going off his meds, and what was it, the next day he died? How convenient, right? Karen McLaughlin, I want everything to come out and be very public so I can say I told you so. I pray for the world's eyes to be open to the truth. Great, Karen. I agree. Larry Bird says, let the games begin, Linda. Yep. Blue Healer 100 says his execution was mentioned on CNN and not retracted. Well, I never watch CNN that much. I don't really like to listen to those guys because most of it is, pretty much all of it is misdirection anyway. But I don't think it really matters. We understand the broad picture here, ladies and gentlemen. You notice the Democrats have gone a little more silent with attacking Trump because they realize it doesn't work, and it's not working. Even the mainstream media has tended to pull off a little bit. They like to quote on his tweets, though, don't they? He definitely came out with some major hits, here lately. And I can understand why, because this has got to stop. It just comes down to that. Moving on with the about the Senate Judiciary Committee, Flake and a Democrat from Delaware, Senator Chris Coons, conveniently, the bill's co-sponsor, tried to pass the legislation by unanimous consent earlier this week, but it was blocked by Republican Senator Mike Lee. Lee argued the bill would fundamentally undermine the principle of separation of power. McConnell is able to bring the judicial nominations directly to a floor vote, regardless of whether they are voted on by the Senate Judiciary Committee or not. He has been refusing thus far to bring the Mueller legislation to the floor, and seems unlikely to change his mind, calling it a solution in search of a problem. In other words, they probably just think it's going to fizzle out. Well, it's been almost 2 years for President Trump, and Mueller has been going pretty much ever since. And they've been spending millions after millions of taxpayer dollars. And they continue to laugh and chuckle and just continue to plow through money. So of course President Trump is going to fire back on Twitter. I would. Vicky Ferguson, thanks, Vicky, for coming to the chat. President Trump is innocent. That is all there is to it. I agree with most of that. Nobody's perfectly innocent, including myself, but I think he is for the people. It's hard, though, whenever we've been indoctrinated to an extent that you have to be jolted. It's like a jolt of electricity. If you don't shock yourself, you're just really going to go back to your old ways and just really not pay attention to what's going on in front of you, right out from under our noses, ladies and gentlemen. So that's pretty much all I wanted to bring to you today. If you have any questions, please email me at screenhoopla@gmail.com. Again, I have a new screenhoopla.com website coming out so that you can conveniently go to that instead of always trying to come here to YouTube. I'll have videos on there and publications of current news as accurately as I possibly can. And so I can try to get a little bit control back and out of YouTube's hands. But I appreciate every one of you. And if you have any more specific questions, Soulshine, thank you for coming to the chat. The Dems and Rhinos know Trump holds the aces. Well, I think he's been holding on to it for a while. I don't know about this G20 thing and with President Putin of Russia, what's going on there specifically, but I don't think it's something that's good for the United States. I think also with the border crisis, people all over the world are starting to see what President Trump is actually doing for this country financially. As far as at the current moment, anything can change, I'm sure. But inevitably, they see that, and I would expect that more and more people are going to try to do the same thing because President Trump is really doing it to himself. He's making things better, and many human beings around the earth are going to run to that kind of thing. They want to run to places where they can take care of their family financially. But at the same time, they're going to hide the criminals within those caravans, if you will. And that makes a sense that we as American people have to protect ourselves. So there's a lot of things going on with that. But it just boggles my mind, ladies and gentlemen, that Nancy Pelosi, and you can look at this for yourself, it's on Wikipedia, and it states that she has not been opposed, really, in her own district since 1987. I mean, what is that, 30 years ago? 31 years ago, ladies and gentlemen? I mean, literally, she has been ruling the roost in Washington, D.C., and here's another little fact for you. I don't know if you know this, but when I came across this, I was astonished. In the 2000 and 2002 election cycles for her, she held the distinction of contributing the most amount of money and funds to members of Congress to other congressional campaigns. Now, that's really probably why she has a lot of support. And you know how she can do that? In part because she is in a safe district, in her own district in California. She is basically unopposed. 80% of the time she's going to win constantly. So what does she do? She doesn't spend the campaign funds that she raises on her own campaign because she's already got her seat locked in every election cycle. So what does she do? She takes some of those campaign funds and she redirects them to others in the House, basically persuading them to vote her way, obviously. And she's been doing that at least since 2000 and 2002, at least 15 to 20 years. Now, I can understand how other different congressmen and senators can donate to other congressmen and senators that are trying to win a seat in their own districts, in their own states. I can understand that. And I didn't realize that up until, a few weeks ago, that's not against the law, especially if they're in the same party. But that's exactly how she's doing it. She's persuading her own constituents in the House to support her. And if they don't, she probably comes back and say, okay, in the next election cycle, I will not financially support you. Behind closed doors, of course, because she's not going to say that out in public, even though she likes to go on every day and talk her little head off about how President Trump is the worst president of all time, with no definite reason for it.